a historian is on from the University of Virginia, so she gets the prize for becoming the longest.
Oh yeah, it's not too bad, but never really been to the Midwest before, so it's my first time, I would say. Okay, well, as Dr. Skidmore said, my name is Karen Anderson. I conducted this research in Israel last summer about ISIS recruitment of children specifically. So my thesis statement, essentially the core of my research question, the Islamic State has begun to change the nature of child participation in terrorism. Children play an active role in the Islamic State's short-term and long-term strategies, which include their need to ensure the future of the Caliphate, to effectively propagate, and to target the vulnerable. The perspective of longevity and transparency ISIS has adopted with regards to its use of children is unparalleled by terrorist organizations. ISIS has created a generation that will be dangerous to the world far beyond the present day. So what is the strategy that children play a role in? So ISIS' strategy in using children is threefold. One, by training children, ISIS is ensuring their future and the stability of the Islamic State. Two, the effectiveness of ISIS propaganda is enhanced by using children. And three, children are an easy and convenient means of recruitment. So starting off with some background and how children have played parts in war in the past, I would say child recruitment has become a common phenomenon of modern conflict. We see this especially as the nature of warfare changes. So we're seeing a shift from conventional warfare to unconventional warfare in the form of terrorism, insurgencies, and guerrilla warfare, which makes civilians very vulnerable to conflict and therefore children. I would say these statistics are very, very surprising. Estimated 300,000 children, most under 15, are involved in conflict worldwide. The discussion of the child soldier mainly stems from African conflict, but it was introduced into the Middle East in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. So the evolution of children in terrorism, how do they become involved in terrorism? Or one key characteristic of terrorism that is really crucial to understanding how it evolves throughout time is that terrorism adapts according to the countermeasures taken against it. So first, men primarily become involved in terrorism, and then they become targets of suspicion. Following that, women participation in terrorism becomes beneficial as well. Has anybody here seen the Battle of Algiers? It's a documentary of sorts that it depicts the FLN's, battle against the French occupation of Algeria. And the woman in this movie, they're Arab women, they disguise themselves as a French woman and are able to bypass security checkpoints and subsequently blow up restaurants and train stations merely because they were women and they were able to bypass these checkpoints. So after women participation in terrorism becomes more popular, they become targets of suspicion, and children involvement becomes more beneficial. Children, more than men and women, they arouse no suspicion, they're associated with innocence, and thus they're able to bypass security forces much more easily. So the historical precedent of children in terrorism. Using children in terrorism ensures more operational success. As I previously mentioned, they're able to evade security measures more effectively and thus more capable of succeeding in operations. It is usually a display of desperation on behalf of a terrorist group. It demonstrates a last grasp at gaining personnel in order to carry out operations and also to ensure its own survival. Committing terror has become very difficult, especially in a post 9/11 world, and thus using children often hints at desperation. And it is also a hidden practice, meaning that it is not advertised typically. So there are a few ways that ISIS recruits members. One, I call this ambiguous membership, because with this type of recruitment of children, it is unclear whether or not children know the nature of the activities they've been brought into. With this type of recruitment, it's very popular for foreigners to bring their family to the Islamic State, and subsequently they bring their children. So adults and family members can play a major role in how children become involved in ISIS. And I want to show this clip. This is from the Vice News Islamic State documentary.
Had also arrived. Abdullah the Belgian, as he's called, travelled to the Caliphate from Belgium with his young son.
وهو خصوصا للشباب كثير ترجع الموسيقى لمن؟ لا يوجد الكفار وهنا لا يوجد دولة الإسلام دولة الإسلام أكيد ماذا تريد أن تعطي مجال أو مع الاستشهاد؟ مجال
So I think this is a very telling video of how family members can deeply impact child involvement in ISIS. As we see here, this family came from Belgium, and the father very much encourages his child to actively participate in the Islamic State. Next, we have voluntary membership. So ISIS often lures children via materials, or it often has a psychological appeal. So material appeal, they often use like gifts, women, toys, and candy. They will set up booths outside Muslim festivals and mosques, distributing candy and soda alongside things like religious pamphlets and CDs in order to lure children into their ranks. They promise an improved standard of living, so children actually get paid. They are paid about $100 per month, and historically, this is not. Children do not get paid to be soldiers. They do not get paid to be terrorists. So ISIS can offer improved standard of living. There's also a psychological appeal, especially more towards Syria and Iraq. There's little structure to a child's life. ISIS provides structure that gives meaning to social and cultural life, such as religious instruction, school systems, health systems, and this is very important to how a child is raised, and ISIS can provide this, whereas Iraqi and Syrian government cannot because it's so ravaged. It also evokes jealousy, so if children see other children wearing ISIS garb or carrying weapons, they want to be a part of that. Next is involuntary membership, which primarily affects minorities, especially the Kurds. So ISIS has been known to kidnap Kurdish children and then train and indoctrinate them in schools, especially the boys. With girls, they often become concubines of fighters. And then the last type of recruitment will be international. So nearly 4,000 Westerners have come to the Islamic State. The highest absolute number of foreign fighters from Europe comes from France. There's also a major growing influence in Southeast Asia and Indonesia especially. ISIS utilizes what I would call weaponized education, so they infiltrate they infiltrate classrooms in order to instruct children in Islamic ideology. The greatest hotspots for ISIS recruitment and operations is in North Africa. That's where they're annexing territory currently. So Libya is a major site of ISIS operations. They operate in Benghazi, Sirte, Tripoli, and Derna, and they also operate training camps there as well. And then Nigeria is becoming a hotspot for ISIS recruitment as well because of Boko Haram's allegiance, which was pledged in 2015, I believe. So how does children play into ISIS's strategy? Okay. ISIS's main goal is to establish caliphates. And ISIS is very different from other terrorist groups in that it is a pseudo-state. It has it's bounded geographically. So it must ensure a stable state, and it must be able to survive a generation in order to ensure the future of the caliphate. And thus, children are crucial to this goal because they are the future. They are the next generation that is going to solidify the holdings that ISIS has and to advance the future of the caliphate. So ISIS needs to train their children. It does this in two ways, physically and mentally. Physically, this is actually often the content of ISIS propaganda and recruitment videos is showing children undergoing physical training in camps. There are 5 known youth camps in the Raqqa province of Iraq. At least one is for English-speaking children, and there's also a boys and a girls school for children as young as 6 to 14. I would argue that the mental training aspect of a child is the most important way a child is trained to become a fighter for ISIS. Because a child is only so useful if he follows ISIS ideology and sees violence as a way of life. So there are 3 ways that ISIS does this: indoctrination, exposure to violence, and total organization. Indoctrination, subjects in schools, subjects like art, history, sports, science are not taught because they're deeply incompatible with Islam. They encourage to start very young, so that it ensures a child's compliance with ISIS ideology and they do not know a different way of life. I think a very scary and very telling example of this is it's in this manual. It's called A Sister's Role in Jihad. It's a guideline for ISIS women on how to raise mujahideen children, which I would argue is one of the most critical roles that a woman can play in ISIS, is how she raises the next generation. So it instructs women to read bedtime stories about martyrs and jihadi heroes to their children, show them Islamic and military training videos, and to check the company that their children keeps. Exposure. Children often they see public executions. So Al-Hizbah, which is the morality police in ISIS, announces the time and place of execution and encourages all Islamic State citizens to watch the execution, and then they leave their body in public. They leave the body of the person they executed in a public place for days afterwards, so that it's pretty much unavoidable to see the gruesome scene. And one role that children have undertaken that is, again, not historically seen is the role of executioner. So they often beat, torture, and execute prisoners, and this serves to blunt feelings of guilt, remorse, and disgust, and instills violence as a way of life. And then finally, total organization, in which ISIS has a monopoly control of a child's everyday life. So they filter all information that's deemed incompatible with Islam. ISIS plays they use children in propaganda very often. So by using children, they solidify a reputation of brutality, because abuses of children are especially brutal. So ISIS only exacerbates its reputation of brutality. And so this is always ensuring that ISIS is capturing the world's attention. Nothing will ever push aside the attention that ISIS is getting. They will never go unnoticed. They will never go unmentioned. They're always making the news. And this conveys its authority, and they're always displaying power. So using children is very beneficial to the image they're trying to push. And they also spread influence by breaking the coherency of minority cultures by indoctrinating encouraged children and inserting them back into their communities. They're seeking to break the coherency of another culture. And then finally, they're easy targets. So they're much more affordable, and that's ISIS's largest expense is salaries, so they prioritize investment in people over infrastructure. As we see, they've conquered much land in Iraq and Syria, so that often the infrastructure is already present. So children are paid half the amount of adult fighters, so ISIS can balance this need to invest in personnel, but also keep expenses affordable. And then finally, they're the most vulnerable population. They have an enormous potential to become perfect fighters because they have such impressionable minds. So what does the future trend look like for child recruitment in ISIS? And I argue that child recruitment will expand as long as these factors hold true. One, as long as ISIS expands, not just in Iraq and Syria, but in North Africa as well. And that is something we're seeing, and is something that is urgent. So as long as ISIS needs more personnel to solidify control, they will need families and they will need children. And then finally, if counterterror measures increase, and as long as they are at least present, ISIS will face some sort of desperation and it needs to continually recruit, which will also come in the form of children. And then finally, ISIS is likely experiencing decreasing recruitment rates. One, there's a much bigger crackdown on foreign fighters now. It's much harder to leave. Two, there's tighter control of the Turkey-Syria border. And three, the migration crisis we're seeing makes people less available to the Islamic State. So less people are living in ISIS territory, so there's just less people living in ISIS, and thus it will likely be made up for in recruitment of children, as they are the most vulnerable population. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with 3 points. ISIS's use of children marks a disturbing trend in terrorism. ISIS has ensured the creation of a morally and psychologically disturbed generation who love to fight for the sake of the Islamic State. And the perspective of longevity and transparency ISIS has adopted as unparalleled by terrorist organizations. And I think Kofi Annan in this quote, it depicts this problem perfectly, especially at the end. He says, the scope of the problem vastly exceeds the numbers of children directly involved. So I firmly believe it is a problem that does need to be addressed. It shows incredible long-term goals on behalf of ISIS, and it really is a dangerous precedent that ISIS has set for not only itself, but for the future of other terrorist organizations as well. Thank you, guys.
Donaldson, and I will be presenting on Liberationist theologies within Islamic feminism in post-Arab Spring Middle East and North Africa. In the post-Arab Spring Middle East and North Africa, there have been several different ways in which religion and government have interacted. The implementations of religion in law and as a form of government varies from country to country, but their roots are found in texts of the Quran, the Islamic Holy Book, and Hadith, the collection of the Prophet Muhammad's narratives and direct teachings. I aim to briefly show here how the liberationist theologies are being used by scholars of Islamic feminism to reshape and redefine the ways in which the West views Muslim women and perhaps feminism itself within the Middle East. The Arab Spring, as it's been nicknamed, was a collection of major and minor uprisings, revolts, and demonstrations throughout many countries in the Arab world. The Arab Spring began in late 2010, spurred by a singular act of resistance. According to National Public Radio, Mohamed Bouazizi, a young man from Tunisia, was slapped by a policewoman for refusing to hand over his fruit cart after being found that he did not possess the necessary permit to sell his goods. In an act of desperation, he set himself on fire in front of a governmental building, resonating with others in his small town and sending a wave of uprising and revolts into action throughout the Middle East and North Africa. The events making up the Arab Spring varied depending upon the country, and in many cases spurred great progress in the form of governmental and social change. It's important here to understand that these events drew attention to struggles and conflicts within the Middle East and North Africa. To analyze the role of religion in government and society, these countries, in a contemporary setting in these countries, we must look at the region in the post-Arab Spring context, examining the shift in several instances towards the implementation of Islamic law and governance. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, Islamism refers to the belief that the political system should be influenced by Islamic religious beliefs and tenets. More notable cases of Islamism within the government occur in Egypt and some Gulf countries. In Egypt specifically, the Islamist group, the Muslim Brotherhood, began as a party concerned with making the state more Islam-centered, wishing to implement Sharia law, but over time expanding their platform, no longer calling for an Islamic state outright, but instead aiming to have a democratic state influenced by Islam. Throughout the West, and more specifically in the United States, the term Islamism has become increasingly problematic and often synonymous with extremist and terrorist organizations. Saba Mahmood states that the West often frames Islamism as a movement or eruption of religion outside the supposedly normal domain of private worship. But this same religious-secular divide that we can see in the United States cannot be found to the same extent in the Arab world. And linking these concepts is dangerous because it presumes that Islamism can only be harmful in any part of the world. In more religious-based governments, Sharia law is implemented to help control public and private actions of the citizens, with some countries adding an additional police force to help regulate these laws from day to day. Sharia translates to path in English, often used as a guide for Muslims in daily life. These are derived from religious texts of the Quran and Hadith and cover things from eating habits to appropriate clothing. They're applied to everyone within the community, but scholars and civilians both within and outside the region often believe it's women who get the most scrutiny under these regulations. The degree to which these guidelines are implemented within a given country depend upon the very government that's in control, and that has changed over time. In Egypt, under the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, women were to veil themselves in public around those who are not their immediate families. With the rise of a strict interpretation of Islamic law came a rise in the prevalence of the female veil in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. In other countries like Morocco, the influence of Sharia law has been less prevalent. There's no doubt that the religion heavily influences the lives of the people there, but for the most part, there's no official police to protect the religious laws as in other countries. Within the past 2 decades, Islam in Western countries has primarily been perceived as other and oftentimes unwelcome. Following the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks in New York City, these negative attitudes towards Muslims and Arabs have been exacerbated. According to E. Darian Smith, dehumanizing media images of the enemy was to paint Al-Qaeda and Taliban terrorists, and by implication all Muslim and Arab men, as inherently violent toward women. But it's also important to note the images and rhetoric around the need to save women. Only looking at this side of the equation surrounding women in Afghanistan and other Muslim countries, and especially the politics of the veil, ignores the complexity of Islam's influence over the daily lives of people within the region. These structures of inequality are bred through the histories of each country, oftentimes involving European colonizers as facilitators of oppression. A more thorough examination of cultural norms in the Middle East and ways in which they go against Western notions of gender roles and agencies is found in my paper, but it's important to examine liberation theology as its own entity before seeing how it's used within Islamic feminism. The term liberation theology, big L, big T, if you will, came about in the Roman Catholic context as work was being done to physically and spiritually liberate the poor in Latin America. It's since been applied in other contexts as a tool to help liberate marginalized peoples. It's questionable if this term itself can be applied to Islam in the Arab world, as it was brought about to reread the Christian Bible for passages promoting equality and liberation in Latin America in the 1970s. But there's no doubt that there is work being done in the way of liberationist theology, little l, little t, within the Middle East and North Africa. While there are many scholars who use various liberationist theologies to promote equality, Letty Russell's work seems the most poignant here. Letty Russell does not use the term liberation theology in her work, but nonetheless works from within a religious hermeneutic to prove the necessity of women's liberation. Working within her own faith, she's created a network of women around the world who also work on liberation of women from a feminist perspective. She's not rejecting faith, as an answer or tool in creating equality within a given society, but making it apparent that understanding the patriarchal structure of the religious and societal institutions are crucial in resisting them from a liberatory stance. While the efforts of liberation theology within Islam are harder to come by, ideas of liberationist theologies, little l, little t again, are present in the work of advocates of change. Muhammad Yadagari notes that some scholars have gone back to their religious text, re-examined them, and reinterpreted them in light of modern needs, working to reevaluate Islamic holy texts for messages of equality. They argue that these verses have been misunderstood by centuries of patriarchal control and interpretations, and looking at the life of the prophet himself can prove that he intended all to be equal. In arguing for equality with supporting evidence against the misuse of the holy books to control others, women's voices can be heard and female characters from Holy Scripture can be learned about to better understand how women should act and interact with others throughout their daily life. Feminism within the Middle East and North Africa has been at work prior to the start of the Arab Spring, but has since picked up speed in many countries for numerous reasons. Islamic feminists have been working to have their voice heard within the realm of religion, government, and society. Because women have been pushed into the private sphere for so many generations, liberationist theologies within Islamic feminism are being utilized and promoted to help the fight of equality within the Middle East. I hope here to have briefly shed light on the various ways liberationist theologies can be utilized within Islamic feminism in post-Arab Spring Middle East and North Africa. Fatima Sidat takes note that feminism within Islam is unique because it works from within the religion rather than critiquing the religion from outside its confines to spur change and an open dialogue about prevalent issues. Scholars and civilians alike use the holy texts of the Quran and Hadith to better understand their role within a given society. This movement, both within and outside the Arab world, driven primarily by Muslim women, has led to further discussion of women's roles in society, as well as how they can be better included in all aspects of Muslim life. Specific to feminism within the field, both liberation theology, big L, big T, in the West, and liberationist theologies, little l, little t, at the heart of the Muslim world, work against patriarchal structures of religion, government, and society to justify their rights and create discourse on the true Sharia, or path, to living a life for Allah. Thanks.
Sorry, guys.
Never mind. Let's do it.
If you try to hit that button again, bring up that screen again. Yeah, hit that check button. And then if you go to display, it says multiple monitors. It's like the first drop-down box. Just kidding. Go to multiple displays. And then extend these displays. And then okay. And then if you hit the present button, you should be able to. But not 100%. So go ahead. I'm just ruined everything, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, we'll just present it without. Yeah, it's not even up there.
Nope. Sorry. You want me to fix it so you can just see most of it?
Hold on, let me see this.
Sorry for ruining
Okay, it's okay. So after this pursuing a united realist and constructivist theoretical approach. So my thesis is that approaching Daesh from only a realist or only a constructivist perspective will fail to effectively destroy both the organization and its ideology. So in order to win the battle against Daesh, we must both destroy the territory of the so-called Caliphate and undermine the ideology. So I'm going to start with a brief review of realism and constructivism, and I'm going to utilize our good friend Dr. Seuss. So I'm going to read you a quick excerpt. On the last day of summer, 10 hours before fall, my grandfather took me out to the wall. For a while he stood silent, then he finally said, with a very sad shake of his very old head, as you know, on this side of the wall, we are the Ukes. On the far side of this wall live the Zooks. Then my grandfather said, it's high time that you knew of the terribly horrible thing the Zooks do. At every Zook house and in every Zook town, every Zook eats his bread with the butter side down. Dr. Seuss then continues in his book to discuss a arms race between the Ukes and the Zooks. And if I had more time than 15 minutes, I'd read you the whole book, but unfortunately I don't. So the Ukes and the Zooks go from stickberry switches to triple sling jiggers to jigger rock snatchers to peekaboo spaniels to utterly spuddlers and big boo gurus. In the real world, where we don't have Ukes and Zooks, we have small arms races to large arms races to nuclear arms races. This fits a very realist perspective of international relations. That international relations is about state A versus state B, competing militarily for control of power in the international arena. But there's another point of view that Dr. Seuss is getting at. He's talking about how there's a fundamental difference between Ukes and Zooks. And this difference is whether butter is put on the butter side up or on the butter side down. And if we don't understand that fundamental difference between Ukes and Zooks, or Americans and Russians, from the West and the Islamic State, Daesh, we won't understand how to map those differences. So a quick note on nomenclature. You will hear me use the word Daesh for the remainder of this presentation. Daesh goes by many names, including the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL. I have chosen to use the word Daesh, which was coined by a Syrian artist, which is an acronym of the Islamic State in Arabic, in an effort to delegitimize the claim of the Islamic State state. So who is Daesh anyway? So this is the most recent map from the International Institute of War, showing the territory that ISIS, or that Daesh controls, as well as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who's the current leader of Daesh. And if you have questions about who Daesh is, and the kind of territory they control, please read my papers that speaks about it in a lot more depth. What I'm going to focus more on in this presentation is what the ideology of Daesh is. General Michael Nagatu, who is a Special Operations Commander for the U.S. and Middle East, said, we have not defeated the idea, we do not even understand the idea. And when he's talking about it, he's talking about the ideology that motivates Daesh. So to defeat an ideology, you have to understand the ideology. In order to understand an ideology, you have to have empathy with that ideology. And that's hard, because it's really hard for us to conceptualize and try to understand the things that motivate people to do the things that Kara talked about in her presentation. So what is it that Daesh believes anyway? Their belief system can be broken down into 4 major ideas. The first is that they're militant Sunni Salafism, which is a militant and military-based, Sunni being one of the larger of 2 major branches of Islam, Salafism being a belief that we must go back to the ideas of our pious forefathers. So they're trying to bring about a Islam that is more similar to the Islam that was originally established in 8th and 9th century Arabia. So having child soldiers, executing people, those things don't make sense in the context of the 21st century. But they do make a lot of sense in the context of the 8th and 9th century. The other major necessity for Daesh is the need of a caliphate, the necessity for terror word is apostasy. And generally, apostasy is a term that's used to discuss the movement from one religion to another religion. So from Islam to Christianity. Daesh conceptualizes this change differently. So it's not just that it's Muslim to Christianity, to Christian. It's that it's any person who doesn't practice Islam in exactly the way that Daesh practices. The fourth major tenet of their belief system is an apocalyptic worldview. That's really embodied in what's known as the invasion of the army of Rome. So Daesh believes that what will happen is that an army of Rome, which depending on the scholar that you speak to, is either the Turkish army, an army of Western followers, a Christian army. So it can come and invade their state, take them over, and then they're going to go to Jerusalem, a very small contingent of them. They're going to be nearly wiped out, and Jesus Christ is going to come from the sky and save them. And then they will all rule the world. So the significance of that apocalyptic worldview will come into play a little bit more later. Quick note, is that all Muslims? Absolutely not. And that is discussed also further in the paper. Okay, so what are we doing about it anyway? What is it that, why did that not change? I'm sorry, guys. Yeah, these two are just not, mine and that one are not in coordination, so unfortunately we might have to do this without visuals. It does not. Okay, well, make it work. So, what are we doing about it? We're basically taking a three-fronted approach to combating ISIS, Daesh. The first approach is the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, or CSCC. The second is called the Information Coordination Cell, and the third is the use of lethal force. CSCC, when it was introduced to President Obama in 2010, he reportedly said, "This is what I've been looking for. Why haven't we been doing this already?" And it was originally designed to defeat Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula by creating a counter-messaging campaign, basically speaking to young Muslims, not only in the Arab world, but around the globe, to explain to them why they shouldn't join terrorist organizations. Unfortunately, their social media uses, they're completely out of their league in social media uses. And I wish my slides were working because I have a slide that will show you the video that was put together by the United States as compared to the response video put together by Daesh. And I don't know, I would absolutely click on the Daesh video before I would click on Islam, or on the US's video, just because it looks more interesting. In addition to being out of their leagues as far as social media goes, CSCC is both underfunded and undermanned. For example, the CSCC does not operate during the prime hours in which most people in the Middle East are online, due to time changes between Washington and the Middle East. This just doesn't make logical sense. So the second way that the United States is working to combat Daesh is through what is called the Information Coordination Cell, which is part of the 62-country coalition put together by the U.S. and their allies. The Information Coordination Cell recognizes that the United States is not the Islamic authority. For the U.S., a non-Islamic country, to tell young Muslims how to practice their own religion doesn't make sense. So the Information Coordination Cell works with our allies, such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey, to speak to Muslims as Muslims about why Daesh's conception of their religion are inaccurate. The third way that we have worked to combat Daesh is through the use of lethal force, through airstrikes, but as well as through the introduction of special forces in Iraq. Unfortunately, we have the capacity to take Daesh out. through the use of lethal force. The United States has the military capacity, looking from a realist point of view, to easily overwhelm what the military capacities of Daesh. Certainly, the 12 countries carrying out airstrikes against Daesh have military capacity. And the 62 countries that are aligned against Daesh certainly have the military capacity to wipe out a terrorist organization. However, what we have to look at is that only looking from that realist perspective leads us into a dangerous zone. If you think back to what I was talking about earlier with this apocalyptic worldview, the Islamic State or Daesh already has a conception that they're going to be defeated and that they'll then rise again. So if we play into that, if we wipe them off the face of the planet, we are only feeding their ideology. If we don't understand that, we don't take that into account in the way that we choose to carry out the war, we run into a big problem. So perhaps what I've been telling you seems like it has no hope, that you can't defeat this organization. You have to take away their territory because they have to have a caliphate in order to be able to pull all of the Muslim, to have any right to tell Muslims what to do. But at the same time, you can't take away their territory without playing into their apocalyptic worldview. So how do you win anyway? So the way that I look at it is as a hydra. So we cut off the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is what ISIS arose from, largely through the use of a realist perspective driven by force. And what arose from that is the Islamic State, Daesh, that now not only does far more than Al-Qaeda ever did. It has an operational state, it controls territory, it's incredibly social media savvy. So we have to take on this fight now. We have to address Daesh today. We have to look at this not just from a realist conception of we'll just bomb them until they stop bothering us. We have to say, okay, why is it that you believe what you believe, and how do I defeat what you believe, not just you? So I'm wanting to leave you guys with a few words from a wise man, Professor Alex Dumbledore, who said, at some point we must decide between what is right and what is easy.
Over the streets of Gaza, there's a sign that reads, "Without you, O Jerusalem, my dreams will never be fulfilled." Over the streets of Gaza, where war reaches its hands into the homes of every family who lives there. There's a conflict in the Middle East that is cyclical. It's been going on forever, and we see a lot of it in the news, but we also don't see a lot of it in the news. Jerusalem has long been a focal point of our interest in the Middle East. It's a monumentally important place for Christians, for Jews, for Muslims, and because of that great monumental importance, there's conflict over those regions, over the land itself, and over what that land means. Jerusalem, I posit, is a bridge between peoples, but it's been used as something to separate distinct groups. Who gets to control the land? Who gets to control the famous religious sites? And all of this has been used as a power of war and as a power to split us into groups. So in Palestine and in Israel, there's conflict. And a lot of that conflict is bred from being split between one another. Jerusalem is the place where we can start to make that whole again. Jerusalem is therefore central to finding a solution to the Palestine-Israel conflict. And so long as one party or the other controls the situation, there will be continued oppression and violence. Unification is the starting point for peace and has been legitimized by international law in the past. This is about carving out of the space in Israel and Palestine what hasn't worked and looking at what will work in the long term to finally find peace. So, why Jerusalem? It's just a city, right? Just a place in the Middle East. However, Jerusalem is of monumental importance for Judaism because it is the place where this religion began to grow. Inside of Jerusalem, there's a place, kind of a complex, a religious complex, known as Temple Mount or Haram al-Sharif. And this place is immensely important for Judaism because it is the home of the first two Jewish temples ever to exist. The main place of worship and where the faith itself was born. And so it's important that Jews had the ability to make pilgrimage back there to their homeland, to the place that they call Eretz Israel, or Zion. So there's a great incentive, right, for people of the Jewish faith to desire to go back to Jerusalem, and that's valid. It's an incredibly valid desire to have, to want to return home to where your people began and to where your faith begins. However, this is problematic because it is also the home of Islam. So Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif also holds, in addition to the Wailing Wall, which is heralded as Jews as one of the most important locations for the Jewish faith, the Dome of the Rock, where the Prophet Muhammad is thought to have ascended to heaven, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is incredibly important. And the third most famous mosque after the mosque in Mecca, the mosque in Medina, and then it's the mosque in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem has long been heralded as the third most important city in Islam. And in fact, before Muslims prayed facing the Kaaba in Mecca, they faced Jerusalem itself. So it's important for both parties. And both parties have legitimate claim to being able to access this land and to being able to access the city, especially when we're looking at religious compounds like Temple Mount. However, control of the land is not easy to dole out, especially when so many different parties want to control certain regions, especially the area around Jerusalem. So, before World War I, Palestine was a territory populated by Palestinian Arabs. And this comes from Charles E. Smith's Palestine and the Arab-Israeli Conflict and History, which is a wonderful document detailing the history of the conflict in a pretty impartial way and going into specific historical documents. But what you can see is that as Jews began to be persecuted in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, they began to flee to Palestine. And what ended up happening is that former settler colonialism evolved that led to a distinct number of differences and has basically amounted to the conflict we see today. So before World War I, Native population living there. Following the end of World War I, when the Sykes-Picot Treaty split up the Middle East and North Africa, Palestine was given to the British to become a protectorate of the state. Basically what ended up happening is the British allowed Jews to migrate in, allowed them home there, and as they began to control the land, Arabs began to revolt against basically having the land taken away by another outside population. This evolved over and over, and basically the accumulation of this is at the end of World War II, after the British have suffered huge economic losses, they don't know what to do with Palestine. They don't have money to support it anymore. So what they do is they give it to the UN. This is the important proposal, which is in 1947, as you can see this set in front of the map. The UN National Security Commission created the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, otherwise known as SCOP, which created a distinction and kind of separated the land between the two parties. But the important place, I posit here, is that you see the small little tan area in the middle right over Jerusalem, right over the city space. And that is under international control, under international law. Now this UN proposal seems to have been probably one of the best ways in the past this land has been divided, probably more equally than any other, but the important thing is that it did not give Jerusalem to Israel, but it also did not give Jerusalem to Palestine. However, following this, in 1948, actually May 14th, Ben-Gurion, the founding and first prime minister of the state of Israel, declared it a state. And with that, ended up taking large swaths of land, killed a lot of Native Arabs, a day known as the Nakba by Palestinian Arabs, and was a massacre, but also known as Independence Day for Israeli Jews. So this land conflict has kind of evolved. But what we can see is that when Israel began to occupy the state, they never had an international legitimation to have Jerusalem. And this is an incredibly important aspect of the conflict itself. Another important thing to note is that the situation on the ground in Palestine and Israel is often not very well represented by the rhetoric we hear every day. So obviously as American citizens, we get a lot of Western-based ideology, especially in the United States, where politics has been very pro-Israeli biased. So it's important to note that the situation on the ground is not necessarily always directly correlated to what we see as American citizens. But in addition, we're looking at what's happening now in the present, right? We've looked a little bit at the past, so now let's look at the present. So what's happening now? So actually in 1980, Israel passed the Jerusalem Law, which would basically take Jerusalem as part of its control. It would become the capital of Israel. However, the issue is that this is not supported by international law. International law still follows the UN Treaty in 1947 that said that Jerusalem is under the international scope and cannot belong to one side or the other. Which is why today we see the embassies, all political representation going to Tel Aviv in Israel instead of going to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is not the accepted capital of Israel itself. In addition, on the ground, especially within Jerusalem, Arab Muslims face significant persecution. So in 2014, Mohammed Abdul Khayr was killed in Jerusalem by Israeli settlers, which set off a series of discussions on how this settler colonialism has impacted Arab natives. But the issue with this violence is not who's right, who's wrong. The issue with this violence is that it's cyclical. That when one person or one group of people kills the other, that generates more and more hate. That generates more and more violence from both sides. So we can see terrorism operations growing out of the conflict. We can see Israel amping up its defense forces. And basically what this means is that we have a devolution into chaos. So what's the future of this conflict? Where do we go from here, right? Like, things are chaotic on the ground, people are dying, human rights are being blatantly ignored in the region, so what can we do? Well, Gershom Gorenberg of the National Journal disagrees with the thought that Jerusalem is unimportant, with the thought that there is no hope left. And in 2014, he writes, Jerusalem is fragmented, more multicultural than any other place between the Mediterranean and Jordan, and while it is constantly described in terms of its history, its future matters more. The stunning, unrealized possibility, wasted potential of Jerusalem is to be a bridge between two societies. And I agree with this. And because of that, my proposition is that a unified Jerusalem under international law is the first step towards finding peace. Now, there's no giant policy initiative that's going to fix the issue in Palestine and Israel. There's a lot of history there, but there's also a lot of space in the future. So what we're doing is we're taking the experiences we've had in the past and seeing what hasn't worked. So what hasn't worked? Having Palestine control all of the territory has not worked because we need to protect the rights of Jews to access those sacred religious sites in Palestine and Jerusalem. What else hasn't worked? Israeli control of Jerusalem itself, because we've seen oppression of human rights and we've seen inaccess to some of the most important sites for the Islamic faith. And what else hasn't worked? Splitting it up between the two. Initially, the Jerusalem border after the creation of the state of Israel was split between the city, but what we saw was that one party grew more powerful and took over the rest. So that half and half split also isn't going to work. So what's left? What can we do now to start making some progress in the city that arguably is the most important to this conflict as a whole? My argument is that to unify the city of Jerusalem, following the partition plan of 1947, finally implementing this plan, finally respecting international law is the way that we will make progress on this issue. One way we can do that is by starting to implement international law, by holding our ally Israel to the standards placed on it by human rights law, the standards placed on it as a fellow of the international community, not allowing these blatant violations of the laws that govern international bodies to continue. This return would be to a corpus separatum, or a separate body. You take Jerusalem and you make it a separate body so that both sides of the conflict can access it. This begins to take some of the emotion of the issue, some of the desire to protect sacred religious sites, because there's fear that if this conflict grows too vast, it will be the start of a religious war. The Jerusalem Institute for Peace Studies explains that the Green Line, the border of 1947, is presented as the legitimate border of the Palestinian state and is not subject to negotiation. Israel has no right to claim Jerusalem as its own, and we can see this reflected in the international community as of late. We've seen the U.S. embassies refusing to be positioned in Jerusalem, which is positive. That is a very good thing, but we need to do more. We need to uphold the standards that we set for the international community, otherwise there will be no hope for change. In conclusion, the banner flies over Gaza, says, "O Jerusalem, without you my dream will never be fulfilled." Without Jerusalem, a dream of peace will never be fulfilled. For so long as this holy city is inaccessible, is a place of rights violations, is a place of colonialism, is a place of oppression, we won't find peace. The international community has a responsibility to start taking these small steps, to start upholding international law, and it is through that that the dream of Jerusalem will finally be realized. Thank you.
So let's see what questions we have.
Should I wait? Or, okay. So this question is kind of can be answered by anybody once again. So take it or leave it. If you want to chime in, go ahead. I think this applies to everything that you guys are talking about. A lot of times when it comes to issues in the Middle East, what you hear, what a lot of people just say kind of almost simplistically is, well, we just need democratic institutions in the Middle East. Democracy is what needs to happen. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts. I'm just curious as to what degree might this be valid or invalid, or what do you think?
So in terms of democracy as a solution for the Palestinian Israeli conflict. This has long been debated. It actually is an interesting phenomenon because you think that as the West, Israel, considered often a Western ally, they would be promoting democracy, right? Like that makes sense. However, they haven't been, because the issue is if there was a real democracy with actual voting for all citizens, Palestinians would have a majority. So this is actually why Noam Chomsky, in his book on Palestine, which was written with another expert, Caliphate, is so monumental that it explains that a one-state solution where both powers had democracy and had equal rights would actually protect Palestinian citizens and the oppressed to do this more. So in terms of how democracy can solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I think that there's great potential there. I think that it needs to be implemented correctly, and that there needs to be a definite valuation of how that will work before they proceed, and both sides have to consent before any action is taken.
But so in the context of the situation occurring in Syria and Iraq with Daesh, I think it's really important to recognize that what we saw in these nations, in both Syria and Iraq, is a call for democracy, as wonderful as democracy is, has led to quite chaos in the region, in large part because the institutions of democracy don't exist. So when you try and create democracy in a place that's not built for democracy, and by no means am I saying that Islamic countries can't be functioning or successful democracies. I'm saying that these countries at this point, in the way that they had lived under oppressive dictatorships for decades, in fact, for the entire existence of these states as modern states, they were not at that point ready to undertake a fully democratic effort. And moving so quickly into that democratic effort pushed them into chaos. So we can look at the situation in Egypt perhaps as an example of how that happens. Egypt, Arab Spring, you can speak more to the Arab Spring than I can, but goes from an oppressive dictatorship to a democracy with very good elections, fair, free, fair elections. And then they overthrow that democratic leader for another because the society was not yet built to sustain that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we often associate democracy with state building. I think that's a very wrong connection to make. We think if we promote democracy in certain areas, that's going to build up states, but in reality, that's not the case at all. It's a very Western perspective to take, and it takes, and if you do look back in history, including European history, it took a very long time for states to emerge. And studies have shown that, like, pushing democratic states in transition are actually much more likely to experience violence than authoritarian regimes, as well as stable democratic regimes. And so there has to be certain institutions in place. And we often project the Western experience onto the Middle East without really regards for culture and understanding different issues. Like, for example, tribal affiliations have often taken a lot of precedent in the Middle East. There's a blatant disregard for how that impacts democracy promotion. In the case of the Arab Spring, I would say, Tunisia is one of the more successful results of the Arab Spring. What happened with Egypt? It's a hard thing. It's a hard question to answer. And one thing, I guess, with Tunisia that makes it a little bit different is one that has a very homogeneous population. I think most of 90% of Arabs in Tunisia are Sunni Muslims. So, like, we often disregard the demographics that do not take place in Europe and America. Again, to tie democracy promotion in with state building, I think is a very wrong connection, and promoting democracy should not be a priority. I would say in the Middle East, and it's not a solution to weak states.
Hi, folks. Let's see here. What was I going to ask about? Yeah, I had. Let's see. Who did the? Oh, right. The cup. You did the cups of the Caliphate, right? Yeah, I was wondering. First off, how exactly does ISIS infiltrate classrooms in Indonesia? Because just, I don't know, it seems like it'd be kind of weird for, a grown terrorist to walk in a classroom and just, chill in there. And then, I also was wondering, you said there were known 5 little camps in Rockland province where they're training children. I guess the U.S. is out of the business, killing children, so basically they know about the camps, but they're not going to do anything because they don't want to kill any of the kids. That basically the issue with that.
I guess to address your first question. What was your first question?
It was about how are they infiltrating classrooms in Indonesia.
Well, I think infiltrating might be the wrong word, but it's not like a terrorist from ISIS just walked into a classroom in Indonesia. It's about the influence. It's about the fact that people in Indonesia are influenced by ISIS ideology and subsequently use that in classrooms to influence children as well. So I wouldn't say it's this direct causality that a terrorist in ISIS flew to Indonesia and walked through classrooms and started started indoctrinating children. But it's the influence. It's the influence that infiltrates the classroom. As regards to your second question. Okay, thank you. Well, I got that information from a nonprofit. It was called Raqqa. Raqqa is being silently slaughtered. So it's an Iraqi-based agency. Yes, I believe America is very much aware that this is going on, but it's, again, right, you can't bomb terror. If America hurting children in the process of trying to suppress ISIS works in ISIS's favor because ISIS can then look at America and say, look at what you did. You're committing abuses against children in your fight against us. And it completely plays into their ability to recruit people if America were to do that. And again, the information about training camps, it's very hard to completely solidify how many camps are in ISIS, in Islamic State and other territories that ISIS has annexed. But they're definitely present, and it's not as simple as just simply bombing into the training.
And kind of adding to that, we've seen in the past Daesh, ISIS, be very effective when the U.S. does things. They tell everybody about it. They tell everybody about it in their way. Al-Hayat is a news source in the Middle East which has consistently showed these videos and news sources from Daesh, as well as, again, they're incredibly effective at their use of social media.
Right.
So if you look at the bomb camp children, I promise you everyone will hear about it, and they hear about it. Dash's turn is not the turn of the United States.
Right, and I was going to ask you something as well about the CSCC, I believe, right? Why is it that they're not, using social media during the actual hours that the folks in the Middle East are on? And then also, do you think that the U.S. should be do you think we should have a no-fly zone in Syria as well, be kind of helping out with more directly taking Assad as well? Because right now Assad's kind of keeping ISIS alive to fight the rebels, so we're kind of fighting one but not the other. So do you think that's a problem that needs to be addressed as well?
Okay, so your first question is about why we're not actually operating our major counter messaging systems during hours when people were trying to message our local.
Yeah, that seems kind of.
And that has to do with the very small amount of funding that CSCC and similar programs receive. And there might be where there's the statistics of exactly what portion of funding is appropriated to these sort of programs. But a lot of times what we see is it's much easier to get an appropriations bill passed that says we're going to buy X number of tanks and X numbers of guns, and in those positions to make those decisions are very comfortable making that kind of decision. Saying, we're going to allocate $25 million to doing things on the internet. When you're talking to senators and upper level policymakers who aren't quite sure how to use Twitter, it's much more difficult to make that argument. And you also can't prove that counter messaging works. You can say, we gave weapons to Kurdish people, and now this was the line before we gave them weapons, the boundary line before we gave them weapons, and this is the boundary line after we gave them weapons. So clearly there's a proof. You can't track the success of counter messaging. You're not going to know the success rate for probably a decade. And so it's much more difficult for us to look at that long-term conception, particularly the way that the United States chooses to do appropriations.
One more quick question for Triana.
So my question is for Hannah, but anyone can chime in if they would like. I read an article several months ago that actually was very similar to your presentation about the cultural and ideology behind ISIS or Daesh that, frankly, the American public just doesn't know about, or makes me wonder if politicians know about, because it seems to be very important to our strategic plan, and yet we don't necessarily see that manifested. So I was wondering, for kind of a two-part question. First, do you believe that peoples in power understand this dynamic or are aware of it? And then the second part is education of American citizens, or even just worldly citizens, in this ideology of ISIS.
So, to answer the first question of do I think people in power understand what's going on, I certainly think people at the highest levels of power certainly understand. I think that members of our intelligence community understand, but they're not sure that that message is getting sent to, because we have such a vast decision-making process in this country. Because public opinion is really important, and the role of Congress is really important. We fortunately don't live in a dictatorship. Having one person who knows what's going on is not going to create a policy in the United States. So I certainly think we should have politicians who are better informed. Watching some of the presidential debates have at times been frustrating and terrifying, kind of knowing this information and not seeing that in the discourse. But I'm very hopeful that when people come to power, not necessarily in the election season, they're going to make decisions based on evidence that they're presented from experts in that area, as opposed to making decisions based on how they feel that day or what their preconceived notions are. And to the second part of your question, how understanding worldly citizens, how worldly citizens understand what's going on, I think that's just an interest. I think all of us being here is in and of itself a step in the right direction, and educating ourselves is the best step we can take. You can't control what anybody else does, but you can control what you do. So making sure you educate yourself on issues that are important and relevant to the world today.
And just a quick follow-up in terms of the second question, educating our fellow citizens as well. Having media outlets give both sides of the news is something that can really, really benefit us. So in the U.S., when we have this pro-Israeli bias, this is really harmful because we're not getting the full picture. So specifically, even across the Middle East, we end up without a clear big picture idea of what's happening. We end up with very focused little news pieces, and this is not the most beneficial way to have a better global understanding of the world.
Thanks, guys.